Welcome to this video. This one is a special one because in this game I pressured my opponent for a really long time and eventually reach a winning position, but I failed to win, and I want to show you that because sometimes when you pressure your opponent and play a good game, it just happens that you mess up in the end and don't get the victory. But this is not to take away from all the time where pressuring your opponent actually ends up working. So you have to accept that sometimes things doesn't go your way, and you can try to learn from the mistakes. But this is part of trying to win. That sometimes it doesn't work out, even though you played quite a good game. So I was playing with the white pieces in Wilton Cup in 2020. I was playing against Kainanen Thybo. There's also another game against Kainanen in this series. So I decided to start with pawn to d4. He responded pawn to d5. Then I played knight to f3, and he played knight to f6. So here there are different ways to play for white. c4 is of course the main move here, but I decided to go for g3, trying to put the bishop on g2. He responded with e6, and then I played the bishop to g2, and he went bishop e7. So basically we're playing quite a normal setup. I decided to castle. He castled, and after the move c4 we reached a very known theoretical Catalan position. But I'm not gonna go too much into detail of the opening. He played pawn to c6. I played queen to c2, preparing to develop my pieces, protecting the pawn on c4. And there are many different ways for white to play in such positions. White can try to bring the knight to d2. He can play b3, bishop b2. Oh. He can also play rook to d1. Sometimes the bishop can go to f4. It all depends on what black does. But let's continue. So he played knight b to d7, and I went for knight b to d2, often going for the break with pawn to e4. So after knight b d2, my opponent went for b6, developing the bishop to either b7 or a6, and I went for e4. After which he took on c4, and I took back with the knight, and he went for bishop to b7. So initially the position looks like white should be better because he has the central pawns and he has some fine pieces, but the theory suggests that it's not at all that clear, and that black has good chances of equalizing here. But after bishop to b7, I brought up my bishop to f4, and there are different moves for white in this position, but I played bishop to f4 in this game, and he continued with pawn to c5, attacking the pawn on e4 with his bishop. So for that reason I decided to defend it. I played rook to f to e1, protecting the pawn on e4. And after that my opponent, he took on d4. And after that I decided that it was time to jump into d6. We're still following some other games have been played in this line, but also white could also try to take on d4, but I think black will play rook to c8, creating a disturbing pin on the c file, and I think black probably should be fine here. So for that reason I played the move knight to d6, hitting the bishop on b7, and at the same time stopping rook to c8, because then the knight can take the rook. So after I played knight to d6, he took the knight, I took back, hitting the rook on f8. And it has to be said, in this game my opponent, he was quite aware of the opening, and he blitzed almost all of his moves. So he played d3, I took with the queen, and now he continued blitzing, playing the move bishop takes e4. The point being that if I now take this bishop, which would normally be desirable, because if he takes, I will take with the queen, and I will have two really strong bishops for the rook. So that will be very good for me. But however, after rook takes e4, black has the in-between move knight to c5, hitting the queen on d3 and the rook on e4 at the same time. So black will be doing very well here. So this is not something white should enter. So after bishop takes e4, I went for the move queen to d4. Now I'm threatening to take this bishop on e4, and at the same time I'm also looking to grab the rook on f8. He kept playing quickly. He played the move e5, hitting my queen on d4. And if I take this pawn, then he can exchange a lot of material. Let's say knight takes e5, and then afterwards he will take on g2, and a lot of material will get exchanged, and it will most likely lead to a drawage position. So I wasn't in the mood for that. So for that reason I played the move queen to a4. Now again I'm re-establishing the threat of taking the rook on f8. So after that, my opponent, he moved his rook, very sensible. I played rook a to d1, bringing my rook into the game. And it has to be said, my opponent actually was still blitzing, so he was probably knowing the opening quite well. He took on f3, I took back. Now I have some really nice bishops, but the point of my opponent's play is to exchange a lot of pieces now. After the move pawn to e4, I will probably have to take this pawn at some point anyways, so I decided that it was time now. So I took, he took with the knight, rook takes e4, rook takes e4, queen takes e4, and here we reach this position. So it looks quite boring. The pawns structure is basically symmetrical. There is no pawns in the center. Each one has pawns from a to b and from f to h. And basically black just wants to get out his pieces, and probably he should be more or less okay. And also the objective evaluation, of course, is that black is only very marginally worse in this position. But in a practical game, it wasn't so easy for black to play, because my bishop is most likely going to be slightly stronger than the knight. There's not going to be a big difference, but perhaps a slight difference. And at the same time, my rook and queen are slightly more active placed than his queen and rook. So for that reason I was still playing for an advantage here as white. And now he went for knight to f6, bring the knight to the king side. Probably a more solid choice was to bring the knight to c5. And now I cannot take this knight, because then my rook on d1 will be hanging. So after knight to c5, white should play queen to f3. And then after a move like knight to e6, the knight is standing quite well here. Probably something like bishop b4, attacking the queen will happen, and at some point perhaps bring the bishop to c3. Maybe queen e8 and queen b7, and white can still try to see if he can get an advantage, but objectively the position should be quite close to draw. So after he played the move knight to f6, I had some different options here. One option was to go to b7, and after knight to e8, making use of this pin on the rook, white has to move rook to d2, which is quite an interesting move, preparing to bring the bishop back to f4. Because the point is, if he now takes, then I'll take with the rook, and I will take with the rook, and he cannot take, because then I will take on a8 and then a7. For example, takes, queen goes to f8, and then queen takes a7, and white will be winning. So, or at least white will be a pawn up, which is close to winning. So instead, black has to play moves like queen c8, and after takes and takes, perhaps white is still slightly better because of the bishop might be slightly stronger than the knight. White has ideas like rook to d7, and after knight f6, maybe bishop e5, sometimes looking at taking the knight and bringing the rook. But of course the position is not much. So after knight f6, I decided to go for another option, which was to play queen to f3, making some annoying threats for black. Right now I'm threatening to play bishop to e7, because if he takes, then the rook on a8 would be hanging. So now he plays the only move for black, which is to play rook to c8, and then I decided it was time to regroup my bishop to a stronger square. So I played bishop to b4, looking at some point to bring the bishop to c3 and include it in the game. So after bishop to b4, my opponent went for queen to e8. Another option was to play queen to c7, and I would have played bishop to c3. But now black could have tried to exchange a lot of material with rook to d8, challenging the open d file, whereafter I would probably have responded with something like rook to e1. But the position is quite equal. I'm maybe slightly better, but it's not much anymore. So after bishop b4, I think queen c7 was the better option. Instead, my opponent went for queen e8. He wanted to play for queen e4, trying to exchange the queens. So I went for bishop to c3, hitting the knight on f6. And here perhaps the best move for black was to play queen to e6 and trying to defend the bishop. No, not the bishop, defend the knight on f6, because now if I take, rook d2, white is very slightly better in this position because of the better pawn structure, but realistically the position should be drawn for black. So after this, probably I would have tried something like queen b7, trying to hit the a7 pawn, and the pressure continues a bit. Black is not safe yet. So after bishop to c3, my opponent went for queen e4, and now comes one of the small moves in chess, can usually be quite useful. Here, instead of taking on e4 or trading on his terms, I decided I wanted to trade on my terms and play the move king to g2, defending the queen on f3, and if he takes, then I will bring my king into the game. So here my opponent was quite insistent on trading the queens, but I think he should probably have played queen to e6, sometimes looking at this pawn, but also just to be more solid. I know he gave me the move king g2 for free, but still it's not so easy for white to make progress in this position. Instead, he went queen takes f3, and I took back. And all of a sudden, I have different ideas of pushing my kingside pawns. This bishop on c3 is doing better than the knight on f6, which is quite useful. So for that reason, white is slightly better here. Also, one thing that's nice about this bishop on c3 is that it stops the black rook from entering on c2, and my rook still has the full open d-file. So the position now is slightly better for white. My opponent tried to bring in the king to f8, and here I missed a great opportunity. I could have played bishop to b4 check. The point being, if he goes back, then I have bishop e7, with the point of trading the rooks and simply bringing in the king in the endgame. The king is a very strong piece in the endgame, so if you can ever make use of it, you should always try to do that. But I thought that during the game, I thought he could play king to e8, bringing the king into the center. But I didn't see rook e1 check, king d8, and bishop f8 hitting this pawn on g7. And if he has to play a move like knight e8, white is certainly better after rook d1 and rook to d4. But it wasn't easy at all, so I don't blame myself too much for not seeing this bishop b4 check, or at least not going for it. So instead I went for the move g4. I don't think it's a bad move, but bishop b4 check would have been stronger. So now my opponent went for h6, trying to stop the g5 push. Another try could have been rook to c4, hitting the pawn on g4. Then I would have went for rook d8 check, king goes to e7, and rook a8. And I keep my pressure on the black position. White is still slightly better here, but if black were playing well, he should be able to make a draw. But in the game happened h6, and I continued with my plan of putting pressure on the black position with h4, sometimes going for g5, sometimes going for h5, all depending on what's going to happen. He played the move rook to c4, targeting my pawns on g4 and h4. And now I decided that because he left the 8th rank with his rook, there was time for an invasion. So I played the move rook to d8 check. He brought in king e7, and I went rook a8, hitting the pawn on a7. And I wasn't so scared of giving up this pawn, because if he takes it, then I'm going to win pawns on the queen side, and eventually I will create a pass pawn there. So after he played the move a5, I played rook a7 check. He went for king goes to e8. He could also, if he went to e6, then I have to move rook to either b7 or also rook to a6, after which he will get in trouble in this pin. So after rook a7 check, king e8, I went for rook to b7. Another option was to try to play h5, fixing this weakness on g7. After we're taking on g4, I will take on g7, and now he's got a new weakness. And this knight on g4 is actually not well placed at all. But I went for rook to b7, trying to pick up the pawn on b6. And here, if black takes on g4, then I'm going to take on g7, and I still have pressure on black. So what happened was that now black made quite a significant mistake here. He played the move h5. And I don't think it's a good move, because anyway he was about to win the pawn on g4, and now he gives me the option of taking the pawn on h5, which I was quite happy about. I didn't want to play a move like g5 because then he can play the knight to d5, hitting the bishop and hitting the pawn on h4 at the same time. So instead I took on h5. And now if he takes back with the knight, then I can take the b6 pawn, and the a pawn is going to be weak, and white is going to have a great position. So for that reason he took on h4. And here I missed a very strong way to convert my position. Here I could have... actually, I think I'm going to make this an exercise because it's very instructive. So white to play. Would you play rook takes b6 or bishop takes f6? Think about that for 5 minutes. Okay, I think the strongest way here for white was to take the knight, and after which black will take back, and then I'll take on b6, he will take on h5, and I will take on f6. And this rook endgame where I'm a pawn up is very good for white, because when he goes rook b5, hitting the pawn here, I will play b3. Now if black doesn't do anything like king e7, then I can bring my rook to a6, having a lot of pressure on the black position, and probably I think this is a winning endgame. I will bring over my king. So instead black will probably go for a4, after which I can take rook to b2, and now I can push the pawn to a6, and I think that white should be winning here. It's still not a trivial win, but looks like very good chances for white to win the game. So after rook takes b6, this is what I did in the game, and I think this wasn't the best way, but I still am very close to winning, having a winning position. He took on h5, and I played rook to a6. So basically what I want is to collect this pawn on a5 and start running these connected passed pawns until I make a queen. So after rook a6, he gave a check on f5. I played move king to e2. He went knight to e4, hitting the bishop, hitting the pawn. And now I played quite a strong move, bishop to e1, protecting the pawn on f2, and at the same time hitting the pawn on a5. Then he played the move rook to e5, making the trick that if I take on a5 now, he's gonna have knight to c3, double check, and then afterwards he can take the rook. So for that reason I had to play the move king to f1, and now my king is quite safe here on f1, and white is very close to having a winning position. So then he played rook to d5, and now I made a mistake here. I took with the bishop on a5, but I should have taken with the rook. This was quite a famous example of the move 40. This particular case was happening at move 40, so if it was maybe one move later, I would have more time to think and make the correct decision. But I decided I wanted to keep on the rooks, but this was a mistake, because after rook takes a5, bishop takes a5, white should be winning this position. The passed pawns are simply too strong. What I was afraid of was that he was able to trade one of these pawns for my pawn, and then would be able to sacrifice his knight for the b pawn, and then bring his king to a8, which is an elementary drawn position, because I have the wrong bishop in the corner. But in reality this is not going to happen. There is an example line like this. I will start, he gets to trade the pawn, but I will never allow him to sacrifice his knight for the pawns. I can play b6 and then a6, and my pawns are too fast, and he doesn't get the chance to sacrifice as he would like. Because for example here after knight c8 I have the move b7, winning the game. So that was wrong by me. I took with the bishop, I'm still having close to a winning position, but the other one was much more simple. And he played the move g5. I went f3, pushing away this knight on e4. He played knight c5, rook a7, f5, bishop c3. And now it's not so easy for me anymore, but I still want to try to push my pawns, if possible. He played knight to e6. I played king to f2. Right now, he was looking at trying to get some counterplay with perhaps bringing the knight to f4. I played king to f2, knight to f4. I played a4, rook to d3. Now he's coming with counterplay ideas like g4, which is a bit unpleasant. For that reason, I played rook to g7. He played rook to d7. And now the endgame is no longer so simple after if I take on d7. Not like before, because black is going to already have made a lot of progress on the king side, and his knight is going to be better placed than before. So here it's not so simple. That reason I kept on the rooks, and here I could have played a5, but I played a bit around with my rook, gave some checks, and this is not so important. But very soon comes the critical moment that after rook to b4, here I felt like I had pressured my opponent for the whole game. It was quite a long game. Right now we're at move 54. And here I make a very big mistake, basically throwing all my chances away of winning the game. So here I played the move a6, where I literally forgot that after a7, knight c7, rook d8 check, he can protect his rook like this. And instead, I should have played rook d8 check first, and after king e6 or king c6, I can push my pawn, and if he takes, then I have a7. If he plays knight c7 or knight b6, I will take the rook on d4. Or if he goes rook to a4, not rook c4, rook to a4, then I can make a queen, and I will have an easily winning endgame where I have a rook against a knight. So basically, here it was quite unpleasant because I had pressured my opponent for a very long time, and then when I'm just one move away from winning the game, I messed it up, and something, I'm not sure what happened, but I guess in my head I played rook d8 check first, but my hand played a6 first, and the wrong order cost me the win in this game. But I wanted to show this game anyways, because it often happens that in your games you will pressure your opponent for a very long time and reach a winning position and be very close to the win. And then also you have to accept that sometimes it doesn't work out, and you have to be ready to pressure the next opponent in your next game just as much, because you need to keep increasing your chances of getting the wins. So even though this one didn't work out, I was still ready for the next game to keep pressuring the opponents. But still, let's just summarize quickly what happened in this game. I'm not gonna go much through the opening, but I got a slightly better position. But black is also very solid. It's a symmetrical position. I brought my bishop to c3, and because of he traded the queens, I had the chances after king takes f3 and going for g4 and h4. And yeah, so I kept on the pressure in this endgame, and I had different chances to convert, including king f1 and rook takes a5. But even in the end, I had the opportunity to play rook d8 check followed by a6. after which the win would be home. But I messed it up, and this is what happens. And you have to be able to deal with it, that such things they can happen, and you should be ready to fight again the next game. So thanks a lot for watching this video.